Invincible Louisa by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 9, Little Women. To one who has gone through all her life in the ordinary sunshine and shade of bright hopes and unavoidable disappointments, it is very strange to stand all at once in the artificial spotlight of totally unexpected fame. From the moment her book appeared, life was entirely changed for unassuming Louisa Alcott. She simply did not know what to make of it when letters began to come pouring in, when visitors arrived in numbers scarcely less extravagant, when people pursued her everywhere to get an autograph, a word, or even nothing but a good stare at the renowned Miss Alcott, author of the new success, Little Women. She had finished the book bravely, ending with Meg's engagement, since she felt that the young readers would not care to go forward into the more romantic period of her heroines' lives. It was with some trepidation that she sent the whole to Mr. Niles, for he had been so obviously disappointed over the first chapters. He was equally frank now. He did not find the story as absorbing as he had hoped. It might be better, after all, to give up the idea of publishing it, but first he would lay it before some young friends of his, girls of just that age for which it was written, to find what was their opinion. Oh, wise Thomas Niles to understand that his bachelor judgment was not final in the matter, and to take into consultation the only real experts, the young ladies themselves. The first to see the manuscript was his niece, Lily Almy, who lived at Longwood. She galloped through it and rendered a verdict so breathless with enthusiasm that her uncle paused and thought again. He showed it to another girl and another. Every one of them spoke of it in just the same way. They all of them loved it. It is hard to think of Little Women as read for the first time. It is, to us, a tale so hallowed by the association of our mothers and our grandmothers' delight in it. Before our own day, a completely fresh story it was to them, a book even of a kind different from anything they had read before, a book just about themselves, so it seemed, by someone who understood them completely. It is no wonder that the first readers were enchanted with it. It is to the wisdom and appreciation of those young people that we owe the fact that Little Women was not hidden away forever in that spidery cupboard where Louisa's early failures were tossed in despair. We thank them from our hearts, and Mr. Niles for listening to them. He heard their raptures with some astonishment, and read the manuscript through again. On the strength of their delight in it, he decided to bring it out. We all know what followed. It was almost the first book of its kind, a direct, natural, truthful tale with no straining after emotion and effect. It was just what girls had been starving for, although scarcely anyone knew it. Louisa did when she refused to give up, even in the face of Thomas Niles's disappointment. He cannot be blamed for not seeing the value of the story immediately. Without his wisdom in suggesting it, in persevering with the suggestion, and in leaving the final decision to the girls themselves, there would have been no Little Women. There would have been only a splendid idea in the brain of a busy author who never found time to reduce it to writing or to print. Louisa put into it everything out of her own life and those of her sisters. It was in the shabby brown house hillside with its garden and fruit trees and barn that the most happy and the most truly childlike of her years had been spent. The house in Little Women, however, sounds somewhat more like the orchard house where the Alcotts were living when Louisa wrote the story. Hillside is more evidently Plumfield, the scene of Little Men. The name March rather naturally follows from the suggestion of the name May, a somewhat mild surname for that storm-tossed Abba, who lived through so many ups and downs. The Brook Farm connection with the Pratt family made John Pratt receive the name of John Brooke. He appears in one or two other stories, and always the same, for his steady sincerity and goodness follow the lines of an exact portrait. Anna's contented happiness gave Louisa her knowledge, shown here and elsewhere, of what unmeasured beauty there can be in married life. Louisa put Elizabeth into the story bodily, with all her gentleness and unflinching courage. She showed May to the life, a little spoiled by the others' petting, a person of great charm, and the recipient of many happy gifts, as Louisa was the dispenser of them. The real power of the book, however, centers about Jo. She was Louisa to the life, more so, perhaps, than the author ever dreamed of making her. Louisa's honest opinion of herself was so very humble that she made not the slightest effort to dress up her counterpart in the semblance of a conventional heroine. Her picture of Jo is the farthest thing removed from flattery. She has told frankly of every drawback in her appearance and her nature, her round shoulders, her long-limbed awkwardness, her thorny moods, her headlong mistakes, her quick flashes of temper. Yet Jo is lovable beyond words and more real than any of the others. She is real because Louisa understood her even better than the rest. She stands out from the background because Louisa herself was such a magnificent character that a truthful study of her becomes without any intention a splendid figure also. Louisa's kind but outwardly severe grandmother, known only during the Temple School period of their life in Boston, was put into the book as Mr. Lawrence. Let's try that again. Louisa's kind but outwardly severe grandfather, known only during the Temple School period of their lives in Boston, was put into the book as Mr. Lawrence, the grandfather of Laurie. She has declared that Aunt March is no one, but her family say otherwise. They all see in that autocratically generous lady the reflection of no other than great Aunt Hancock, with her connections in high places, her family tyranny, and her good heart. Louisa could not remember her, but the family legend was enough that Aunt Hancock lives on in thoroughly Aunt Hancockish fashion in some of the kind relatives who were so kind to Jo and Amy. We surely see good cousin Lizzie Wells. Not all of the minor figures can be traced to their originals, but it is safe to say that they all lived and that Louisa knew them. With Little Women, Louisa achieved what she really wanted, a piece of work which she actually knew to be her best. With it, she achieved also the appreciation of the world and such prosperity as gave her full power at last to do just what she wished. It is delightful to read of how her name came to be on every tongue, how she grew to be not merely famous, which mattered little to her, but universally beloved, which mattered much. After all the years of doubting her own powers, of looking for her true field, of thinking of herself as a struggling failure, she was obliged at last to admit, even in the depths of her own soul, that she was a success. It is a joy also to know of what she did with the generous prosperity which came to her so suddenly. After a whole lifetime of poverty, she felt as though the magic purse of Fortunus was thrust all at once into her hands. The Alcott family now moved no more. Louisa had said when they took up their abode in the orchard house that she hoped they would not stir again for 20 years. It was owing to her that they did not. She could at last make the place comfortable, the dilapidated old building, which the last owner had thought fit only for firewood. Here in the big bedroom where the sun came flooding in, Abba Alcott, feeble now and no longer toiling and busy, could sit all day with her knitting and sewing, the beloved books which, for so many years, there had been so little time to read. How often Louisa had said that she wanted a sunny room for her mother. Pathetic record of the dark and cheerless lodgings into which their narrow means had frequently brought them. Her father's study was equipped with extra bookcases to hold his cherished library and the long shelves of his journals bound by Louisa's order so that they could be safe for generations to come. There are some tremendous ideas embodied in those journals, chiefly about education, for Bronson had theories so far in advance of his time that even in our day we have not caught up with all of them. Although we have accepted many, it used to be thought, and not so long ago, that the windows of a schoolroom must have white paint on all the lower panes to keep the children from looking out, and incidentally to keep light and sunshine from coming in. It was Bronson Alcott who first opened the windows of the schoolroom to more than one kind of sunshine, and who has made learning brighter for all time. It was a great and glorious day when Louisa had a furnace put into the orchard house, so that the picturesque open fires need no longer be the sole source of heat. Not so very many years earlier, she had one day a dreadful battle with herself wanting to spend a carefully saved sum of money on tickets to a concert, when, all the while, the chilly feet of her beloved family marched back and forth on cold matting in a room whose drafty floor cried aloud from the carpet. She resisted the temptation and bought the rug, but now, at last, she could do more than make a cold house a little less cold. She could make it actually warm and cheery. She thought of everything, from flannel petticoats upward, to make her beloved ones safe, comfortable, and happy in every spiritual and practical way possible. Amongst all these matters, she thought not of one single thing to do for herself. Her own room in the house is plain and small and modestly furnished, standing today just as it did in her own time. On the table lies the shabby black leather writing case in which she wrote upon her knee, for she had no desk. She had begun her career of authorship on a little table in the tiny room off the hillside garden. She had continued it in sky parlors and odd corners of casual lodgings, with so few conveniences for writers that she never missed them now. All of her life she had dreamed of what she would get for her family, and she never found time for plans concerning what she might get for herself. Meanwhile, Mr. Thomas Niles, walking with his dogs along the bank of Mystic Pond, sitting in the garden of the pleasant old Arlington house, was hatching other plans. A clever publisher was Thomas Niles, one of the most brilliant and enterprising of his time. He was watching the growing popularity of Little Women, and presently had a new suggestion to make Miss Alcott. The book must have a sequel. She made almost as much demur as she had the first time. She was writing about children. No one would be interested in seeing the girls married. After long persuasion, after being shown multitudes of letters always making one and the same request, she gave in. She made one reservation, however, even as she agreed. I won't marry Joe to Laurie to please anybody. The first part of Little Women was published in October of the year 1868. Mr. Niles offered Louisa a certain sum for the copyright of the book, which seemed very large indeed to her unaccustomed eyes. He urged her, however, to make different arrangements under which she would receive a royalty so long as the book was sold. It was his principle that publishing was best carried on by being as fair and as generous with the authors as it was possible to be. It is a happy record that of his connection with Louisa Alcott, his company never had a greater success than the two achieved with Little Women. He found and bought out the work of many another person who was to become famous. Jean Ingelow, Emily Dickinson, Thomas Bailey Aldrich, Susan Coolidge, Helen Hunt Jackson, Edward Everett Hale, and numerous others, great writers of the day, were his immediate friends, in spite of his odd, slow-spoken ways. It is told that Thomas Bailey Aldrich and William Dean Howells would often come to his office to see him, but he would be found by others, arriving late, to be reading the morning papers, since Thomas Niles seemed to have so little to say to them. They so enjoyed the presence of this charming, silent man that they were quite content with a visit, even if it lacked conversation. He was very conservative, in spite of all his enterprise in undertaking new ventures. It is told of him that when telephones came into use, he would never talk into one, but always had the message given and received through another person. The last of those three cousins with whom he lived says that they knew all the authors of their day, that most of them came to the house, but that none were as delightful to have there as Louisa Alcott, who was always overflowing with good spirits and good talk, the very best company in the world. With Thomas Niles, she formed one of those valuable friendships which were milestones in her life. He was her counselor in all literary matters, a willing and devoted guide through the rest of her career. Financial affairs were never to be difficult for her again. With such a source of income, and with such good advice as to what to do with it, he began by being a friend of Bronson Alcott's. He was to end by being Louisa's literary mentor, and by making her fortune. It was no wonder, therefore, that Louisa finally heeded his urging to write a sequel to Little Women, to be brought out in the spring. She set herself to work in November and finished very quickly, sending him the manuscript on New Year's Day. It carried the story of the girls forward into the beginnings of being grown up, into living with their own wings, as the Dutch translator has put it. It showed Anna's wedding, with the guests dancing under the revolutionary elm. It brought to a briefly worded end the simple tragedy of Elizabeth's short life. The Beth whom every reader had mourned, not merely because of what Louisa said of her, but because of what she was. Since neither Louisa nor May were married, it was necessary to expand into the realm of the imagination to supply the desired conclusion for the book. Amy was taken abroad to see all those glorious things which Louisa wanted so much to have May see, when she herself first had the opportunity to travel. At Vevey, where Louisa met Ladislas, Amy was described as meeting Laurie again, and, floating on the lake, these two imaginary ones pledged their lives to each other, and as for Jo, she was dutifully provided with a husband, but what an unexpected one! Where everyone has wondered, for all these years, where did Louisa find the model for Professor Bayer? Is he the ideal combination of qualities which she thought might possibly have touched her own heart? It may be. There is a little of her father in that good Mr. Bayer. A very little. There is a trace of Mr. Emerson in his high principles and his advice to wayward Jo. There is also something of Louisa's more distantly idolized hero Goethe in his Germanic makeup. No record of her own, nor any memory of her surviving family, gives evidence of there having been a real person to stand for that portrait. He is, somehow, less convincing than any of the other characters. This is not surprising, since even in her own mind a satisfactory lover for the counterpart of Louisa May Alcott did not exist. In the rather shadowy figure of the March girls' father, it is hard to recognize Bronson Alcott. Louisa always meant to write a book which should have her father as the central character. She spoke of it by various names. The Cost of an Idea, or An Old-Fashioned Boy. She had thought of it and spoken of it long before she undertook Little Women. She was so unlike Bronson that although she was devoted to him, there were certain of his ideas which she did not truly comprehend, certain phrases of his life to which she felt that she could not do certain phases of his life to which she felt she could not do justice, since she did not quite fathom the motives which lay behind them. She waited all her life for the moment when she really would understand him fully, and she waited too long, for the book was never written. Perhaps it was because she had this plan still in view that she did not make a more striking figure out of the father of Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy. But in one matter, we see her true affection for him coming into the very center of the stage. In almost the last chapter of Little Women, when Jo is married, and the whole family sits about discussing plans for the future, Jo broaches her great idea of what is to be done with Plumfield, the beautiful old place in the country left her by Aunt March. She announces that she and Professor Bayer are going to have a school there. She describes the school. It is to be for boys, for rich boys whose parents neglect them and leave them to servants, so that they have no chance for proper growing up, and for poor boys who would never have proper opportunities to learn. They are to be taught, and there is no use in going into the details of the plan. It is, briefly, the school of which Bronson Alcott always dreamed, the perfect school which he, so nearly, knew how to put into being. The actual realization of it came as close to existing as it ever managed to, in that idea sponsored by a public-spirited man for the public schools of Germantown, in which Bronson and Abba Alcott took such happy and such a brief part. During the first unclouded years of their married life, what was it that Jo said of the plan in Little Women? Her husband could teach and train the boys in his own way, while she could keep house for them all and feed and pet and scold them to her heart's content. Out of the vanished years comes, in that brief passage, the vision of that glorious dream of Germantown. Out of the past comes the figure of Reuben Haynes with his high-collared gray Quaker coat and his deep, far-seeing eyes. He and the Alcotts had to do with the founding of two schools. One is the Germantown Academy, child of Reuben Haynes's first plan, and still educating children as he hoped to educate them. That, however, is not the only school which he had a share in establishing. The other is Plumfield. The second part in Little Women was received with as much acclaim as the first, so that Thomas Niles immediately applied to Louisa for another book to be issued the following year. He may have been a little worried for fear, since Louisa had apparently completed the record of her own family, she might not be able to go on as successfully as she had begun. She did not need the Marches, however, but launched into a new tale, An Old-Fashioned Girl. The heroine of this, Polly, is not Louisa herself, but the adventures and trials through which Polly went follow very closely her own tribulations and her early effort to make a living. Louisa at the time said very little of the difficulties, the disappointments, and the slights which made those years such hard ones to a person of her sensitive, hopeful, exuberant spirits. But those hard moments made a deep impression we can now see, for so many of them come to light in her stories, along with the happiness and the unexpected adventures which fall along the way of the seeker for her daily bread. One small episode reflects very significantly Louisa's own ideas about certain matters. In An Old-Fashioned Girl, someone, in Polly's hearing, refers to her single festive frock, a black silk gown, as that inevitable dress, and calls the girl the little blackbird. Louisa herself put on record a similar incident. People are remarking on how familiar my best black silk has become, she says in substance. I shall either have to get another or go home to Concord. I am going home to Concord. Her reverence for social etiquette and conventional garb was not very great. Older people who can remember say that An Old-Fashioned Girl was an absolutely accurate picture of Boston society in her time, with all its small customs and habits and invariable laws of procedure. As we see Polly break through some of them and express her own opinions of others, we understand fairly well what Louisa thought. The story in its first form was very short, only 7 chapters, but as before, a sequel was so loudly demanded that Louisa presently added the remainder to make the present book. She found the characters amongst her legion of cousins and relatives in Boston, and among her friends. No single person is directly recognizable, but all have the mark of reality upon them. She had worked so hard over the second part of Little Women as to be quite worn out, and to show, alas, that her strength had never come back to its old vigor. A little time before the war, her cousin Lizzie Wells was ill, and Louisa stayed with her to nurse her. Being free for a Sunday and having missed the train to Concord, she walked home 20 miles and went to a party in the evening. Such boundless energy as that was never to come back to her. She was, in fact, never really well again after the hospital adventure. Although she was definitely ill through all of the time that she was writing An Old-Fashioned Girl, she gave no hint of flagging spirits and made the story as gay as Louisa always was herself when feeling her best. The time had come when she had accomplished the greater part of what she had so long ago vowed that she would do. She had made her family safe and independent. She had given them comfort, and she had paid off all the old debts, which ran back to the time of the Temple School. With the ordinary affairs of her life attended to, she turned to a larger and more pretentious dream, which she had harbored long as something impossibly remote. She would send May abroad to give her the artistic education which she felt that her sister's talents richly deserved. She knew just how May longed for travel, just as she herself had longed for it. Her own desire had been laboriously and inadequately fulfilled. May's wish should be answered in full measure, heaped and running over. She consulted a friend, Miss Alice Bartlett, as to plans. Wise and generous Miss Bartlett had a glorious idea. She, too, was going abroad, and she offered to take May as her guest if Louisa would go also. Such a thing as going herself had not crossed Louisa's mind. She pondered it not long, for she was still Louisa, and decided to go. All the delight which she had hoped to have on that first journey and had failed to find was hers now. Louisa was not well. She had worked so hard that she never was to have any full amount of bodily ease again, but she spent small time in lamentation over that. Beyond the ordinary gift of other people, she had the capacity for enjoying herself, and knowing when she was happy. She was not hurried past German castles now, or snatched away from picturesque French villages that she longed to explore, or carried on from beautiful bright countrysides where she liked to linger and bask in the golden warmth of Italian spring. Laughter and lightheartedness attended the progress of these three congenial spirits wherever they went. She looked all about for Ladislas, but she did not find him. Years later he was to come to America, and she was to renew her knowledge of him, but she did not see him now. They landed at Brest and spent a sunny, delightful April in Brittany. As the summer came on, they moved forward to Geneva. Europe was, by this time, in a turmoil on account of the Franco-Prussian War, which broke out soon after they reached Switzerland. That glittering emperor, Napoleon III, who had tried so hard to emulate the power and magnificence of his uncle, the great Bonaparte, was making his last superhuman effort to win glory on the battlefield, and by so doing, to install new life into the dying legend of imperial glory. The Empress Eugenie was holding the reins of government at home, and, amid the ominous muttering of a discontented people, was keeping up the outward semblance of pomp and splendor. The emperor was ill, suffering beside himself with nervous excitement, but still dreaming of glory, while the crash of shells and cannon roared about him, the thundering German artillery, which was to bring down the French Empire forever. Poor old man, Louisa said of him, remembering how she had seen his Paris in its greatest glory. Switzerland was full of refugees. The Queen of Spain and her son were keeping court in a hotel in Geneva, not far from Louisa. The three Americans were interested in the romance and excitement of such great changes, but it all seemed very remote from them. In the autumn, they moved on to Italy. Louisa wrote home of lodgings in a room with a marble floor, green doors, red carpet, blue walls, and yellow bed covers, all so gay it was like sleeping in a rainbow. The whole journey seemed rainbow-colored in its untroubled happiness. It did not matter to Louisa that she had pain in her bones and was often worn out. The good company and the great sights about her were enough, and more, to counteract them all. She wrote home from Brittany, "Ye gods, how I do sleep here," a pathetic testimonial to how she had not slept for many months past. The beautiful journey helped her, but it could not make her well. She told of how Miss Bartlett shopped briskly for antiques, May sketched with energy, and I dawdled after them. It was a blessed relief to have time for dawdling. While they were staying in Rome, news reached them of the death of John Pratt, Anna's husband, leaving Louisa's sister with small means and with two little boys. Louisa was broken-hearted over her sister's grief, but immediately took the steps which were characteristic of her. She took up the pen, which she had meant to lay aside for a long vacation, and resumed her writing, so that John's death may not leave Anna and the dear little boys in want. It was so that she undertook Little Men, and carried forward the account of the school at Plumfield, and the further chronicle, purely imaginary now, of the March family. She took no further joy in her holiday after that, since she felt that she was needed in Concord. It was decided that May should stay on for more study, and Louisa should go home. Her father and Thomas Niles met her at the wharf with news of the book. The manuscript of Little Men, arriving in the mail, almost unheralded from Rome, had been a tremendous surprise. The book was out the day Louisa got home, with such a prodigious number sold before publication that it had already achieved unprecedented honors for a story for young people. Her books had already begun to be translated into various languages. In our time, many have come to be read in practically every modern tongue. It was always plain to Louisa, after she had been away, how feeble and old her mother seemed to become during her absence. It was true that Abba Alcott's iron strength was failing, and that the change, unnoticed by those about her, was evident to any person who did not see her every day. Louisa vowed that she would never go far away from her again. She never did. When May returned, some months later, Louisa gave into her hands, with a sigh of relief, the task of keeping house in Concord. Fame threatened to become an occupation in itself, and leave Louisa no time for actual living. The visitors and the letters and the autograph albums seemed to have no end. She was asked often to speak at schools and colleges, and, having a definite interest in education, she agreed whenever she could. Some people were kind, and she loved to meet them, some curious, and some merely intrusive. Many who came seemed to have no idea that Miss Alcott might like a little privacy, nor did it seem to occur to them that she must have some quiet if she were to produce any more books. To the infinitely repeated question, "Dear Miss Alcott, are you writing anything now?" she was tempted often to answer bitterly, "How can I?" The years slipped by pleasantly, however, quite a number of them without great event. Little Men was nearly as great a success as Little Women. Under demand for more books, Louisa again brought out her novel Success, renamed Work, and got it ready for publication. 2 years later, she wrote Eight Cousins, and 1 year after that, its sequel, Rose in Bloom. Work was widely discussed, as Moods had been, but with no long-lived enthusiasm. The two young people's books, however, were universally beloved. Into Eight Cousins and its sequel, she had put the general atmosphere of the enormous May connection. Everyone interested in everyone else, the elders observing with watchful care just how the younger ones were growing up in these dreadful modern times. Part of the magic of Louisa's charm for young people surely lies in the fact that she sees things through their eyes, that she depicts the ups and downs of the early adventures of life, all from the young point of view. The youthful readers all feel entirely that Louisa is on their side. Much more of the time now she remained in Concord, so that she might be near her mother. Occasionally she walked along the shady streets. She would meet that old comrade Cy, with whom she had played when she was small, who got her to jump off the beam of the barn. They could never greet each other without suddenly bursting into laughter, for the memories of those hazardous days was still common property between the brown-faced farmer veteran of the war and the tall, stately Miss Alcott, famous authoress. Occasionally, when she felt herself able, she would go to Boston for a little, and she once spent several months in New York. In Boston, she still occasionally acted in private theatricals with all her old spirit. There was a great fair to raise money for the preservation of the Old South Church. Louisa was the life of the whole undertaking. Her special show, Mrs. Jarley's Waxworks, with herself as Mrs. Jarley, being a marvelous performance, which was repeated every day for a week. She was tired out by it, and at the end so hoarse that she could barely speak, but in spite of everything, she threw tremendous zest into every scene, and with an uproarious success. When she could, she went to talk to schools, although she never could accept a quarter of the invitations which poured in upon her. She went to Philadelphia and spoke at the Germantown Academy, the surviving school which, as has been said, was born out of the plan of Reuben Haynes. The boys all cheered her as she passed up Schoolhouse Lane. She saw Wick again, where she had played when she was so very little. She was taken to her birthplace, a very old house now and soon to be demolished. At the house of her hostess, she was waited on by a delegation of young persons, grandchildren of those small pupils whom her father had taught. The group of little girls overwhelmed her with questions as to whether Beth really had scarlet fever, why Laurie did not marry Joe, who was Mr. Lawrence. She answered every query, wrote in all the autograph albums, and kissed such of those who insisted upon it. So tired was she, when this interview was over, that she could hardly manage to answer a second summons, which came up to her room a little later. This time she was asked to come down and speak to a delegation of little boys. Unwilling to refuse any request, she came down and found only two young gentlemen, both very shy, and both sitting on the edges of their chairs. Conversation did not go forward very easily, but they were at least persuaded to tell what they had come to ask. "Please, were the pillow fights real?" "They were," Louisa assured them. "They were always on Saturday nights, just before the clean cases were put on for Sunday." That was all they wished to know, and they took their departure completely satisfied. Louisa had sent May to Europe once more during these quiet years, but was overwhelmingly glad to get her back again, to avail herself of the efficient help which May always managed to be. Ava Alcott was really an old woman now. so feeble as to need much care and to call forth great anxiety amongst those who loved her. She was happy and serene, but was evidently not to be with them a great deal longer. In September of 1876, Louisa had arranged for the third time that May should go abroad. She needed a holiday, Louisa said. It was such a happiness to May to have that artist's life which she craved. It was such a joy to Louisa to give it to her. This time there was no question of Louisa's going also. The two daughters could not possibly be away at the same time. May sailed on a windy September day, some such day as on that which Louisa had first set out on her own travels. The two sisters went to the wharf together. Separations were difficult in this devoted family, and were never gone through without pain and misgiving, no matter what golden promise lay in the plans which brought the parting. There was a little prayer which Louisa said to herself many times through her whole life. God help us all, and keep us for one another. She said it on that day, when she set out on the coach from Walpole to try her fortune in Boston. She said it on the day of her going away to Washington to offer all of her strength and eagerness to the service of her country. She said it now as the ship drew out from the dock and gathered way. May, with her blue cape blowing out in the breeze, stood at the rail to wave goodbye. Louisa waved in return, gaily and bravely, her tall figure bending a little to the wind, the tendrils of her chestnut hair lifting, her face bright with the splendid hopes which sped this beloved sister on her way. It is so, I think, that we should always remember her. At that moment, life gave her, perhaps, the supreme amount of what she had asked of it. She had won security for all those whom she loved so much, peace and happiness for her family, this final gift which she was able to make to May. That was all that Louisa had wished for, but she had something more. Warm in her heart was the knowledge that thousands of people loved her, people whom she had never met, whose names she was never to hear. Fame during a lifetime is something to win, but fame and affection, which are to last 100 years, is seldom earned. Those Louisa had, with a richness of deserving, about which we love to think, and we look back at her gay-spirited, vivid, and hopeful waving, not to May, but to us, across the century. And that is the end of chapter 9.